tell you what,
it's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And today we're talking about adaptations of the Robin Hood legend, which are very numerous, and we have already done, a while ago now, a whole podcast about one of those, Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. And even now, even if they can't name more than two of Robin Hood's followers, young people know something about Robin Hood, and there's references to it in all sorts of things. Blazing Dragons, which we've talked about, did a Robin Hood parody episode. There's a couple of references to it in Blackadder, the Robin Hood costume, which we told you all about in our Blackadder podcast, and the Highwayman, who's halfway to being the new Robin Hood because he robs from the rich, but he hasn't got round to giving it to the poor yet, and all that kind of thing. So I think everyone has a decent idea who Robin Hood is.
I've always thought, and I think I even said on the Musketeers podcast when talking about the nature of legends and the formation of legendary characters, that the two staple English legends are Robin Hood and King Arthur Camelot, that everybody knows about. And as you said, I think nowadays Robin Hood is the one that absolutely everybody knows about. Certainly I discovered that when I tried to talk to a young person about well-known English legends quite recently. And I suppose even when we were little, it was the one that was around a lot and in the soup more. The Forest Men Lego range, which you always see it listed as on the internet, and as it was sold in the US, I believe, was very much sold in English, British Lego catalogues as Robin Hood, have exciting adventures in Lego with Robin Hood, and he was very much something you couldn't avoid even if you wanted to, and that's just one example of how.
And there are, as I said, quite a lot of adaptations, but apart from Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, there are only two that really get watched occasionally in this house, because they're the ones that appeal and speak the most to both of us, and those are the Disney film and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which was very much in the soup when it came out in 1991 during our childhood. So we'll start with the Disney movie, which I think is very good and I used to enjoy it as a child. I had a phase of thinking I didn't like it because perhaps I was in an age of non-believing, although I didn't have that much of one, but also I became aware that it was made in Disney's sort of slump. It was made in
1973.
When Walt Disney was dead, and it was after the Jungle Book that his followers really stopped bothering, I think, because that was the last movie that Walt actually worked on. And there are just general things about the Disney slump which are true of Robin Hood, like they started to avoid spending more money than was strictly necessary to get a film out there. They plucked people out of their pool of voice actors rather than finding the right voice for that particular character. They certainly didn't have supervising animators and things for all the different characters. And Robin Hood reuses bits of animation, bits of lines to sort of fill in the gaps in a sequence. You can hear lines again that were there earlier on. I was noticing watching it recently that you can see the construction lines in a lot of the animation, and they do of course do that trick of layering over things that they've already done, like their animals. So the Jungle Book's quite useful for that, and Maid Marian dancing is Snow White dancing from all that time ago. And they have got a couple of voice actors that you have heard before and will hear again, and I used to sort of think, oh, they've just got Phil Harris because they're getting Phil Harris for everything. But actually Phil Harris is right for Little John because he sounds like a bear, which is why they got him for Baloo in the first place. He's not right for a cat, is he? So I think I'm right to go, they shouldn't have used Phil Harris for the Aristocats. Apart from him, they do get the right actors for the characters, even though some of them are from their pool, and they put a lot of effort, I think, into casting Robin and Prince John and perhaps some other ones. And okay, the animation is quite cheap and perhaps it ought to look a bit better, but the story story and the structure and the writing of the lines and all that kind of thing is actually very good.
When I was young, I used to think along the lines of, oh, well, I suppose this makes sense. Disney's making a Robin Hood film aimed at children. It's making the characters animals. When the rooster, Alan Adale, Roger Miller, famous American singer, says, we folks of the animal kingdom have our version, I think that makes sense for Disney to think it's a good idea to tell the story in this way. But actually, I think the main reason is so that they can reuse all of Jungle Book animation.
One thing I noticed, quite as a child I think, was that it was actually rather incongruous of them to have anthropomorphic animals with clothes on and everything, because they would either have people like the princess ones and Peter Pan and stuff like that. Of course, Alice has anthropomorphic animals, but they're in this fantasy dream world, aren't they? Or they would have animals being animals, like Bambi and the dog ones, Lady and the Tramp, One Dalmatians, etc. And then I did reach a similar conclusion to the first one you did. That does make sense for Robin Hood. It's Disneyfying Robin Hood. Maybe they wanted something a bit different, I thought, because even though most of the adaptations we're going to talk about hadn't been made yet, some of them had, and if Disney hadn't made the characters all animals, then it would have been rather similar to those. So I guess they had different reasons, some of them more laudable than others.
The things you come away from thinking, oh, this is one of my favourites. If it works in the right ways and it sticks with you and it gives you what you want and need, it can still be a favourite despite any cost cutting and corner cutting and laziness that they come into it with. And that's certainly the case with Robin Hood. I remember saying at one point the good thing about it really is that it has everything you want from a Robin Hood adaptation, all structured very well together and the bits flowing very nicely into each other. And that's certainly something I think is true of the movie. It is well structured. It does have all the parts of Robin Hood you want to, need to see.
Especially as a child. There are some things that they sort of brush over, like how it all began, and Robin's history with Marian is just briefly gone over in the dialogue.
An interesting difference with Prince of Thieves. I was thinking, well, having that brief bit of Robin and Marian history in the animated one, and when it's Prince of Thieves, they want to create more conflict between Robin and Marian. So instead of we were happy together as children, Prince of Thieves goes for the, all I remember of you as a spoiled bully who used to burn my hair. And I think, yeah, there's not time for that kind of relationship journey in the Disney movie, and they want to do it anyway for that audience.
Sir Hiss, Prince John's counsellor, as he very briefly informs us, and Prince John are talking about how Hiss has hypnotised King Richard to go on the crusade, which actually makes him less of a responsibility-avoiding pillock in my eyes, although I didn't think this as a child, I didn't know much about it, but in that film they're always on about good King Richard, aren't they? And there has to be a really, really good goodie and a really, really bad baddie, because it's that kind of film and that kind of audience, and it works well for children. But they don't go into any more detail than that, again, unlike Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And what the movie has got that you want to see is Robin Hood and Little John going around the forest with their green clothes on. They don't bother that much about other henchmen, and Friar Tuck and Alan Adale don't do that anyway, hang out in the forest with them. But that's okay, it works with just the two of them doing that. And they do a very amusing rob when Prince John is driving by in his coach. And they have as much as they need of the romance, and they have the archery contest. And of course, the denouement is breaking somebody, in this case Friar Tuck, might be other people depending on what you watch, out of Nottingham Castle to avoid him getting hanged. And that's really all you need.
I think I was a bit disappointed when I was young that there weren't more merry men in it. At least Will Scarlet. I'd for some reason taken Will Scarlet to heart as a character when I was young. I think because the Lego figure who wasn't Robin Hood in Robin Hood's Treehouse Lego set was said by an adult to me to be Will Scarlet because he had this sort of red bit of costume. So I was like, where's Will Scarlet in the movie? And the closest thing you get to really Robin Hood and his merry men in the forest, living in Sherwood Forest, that they do, is the kind of campfire scene with Little John doing the washing and Robin Hood ruining the cooking, and then Friar Tuck turns up and talks to them for a bit. He kind of flits between being a merry man in the forest and being a friar in his church, and it establishes the setup for the world well enough. And I suppose in a movie of that length, it's all you've got time for and all you need.
And someone who is not well versed in Robin Hood can name two of his followers. It is Little John and Friar Tuck, which suggests to me that if they've seen anything, they've seen the Disney movie.
And it's very easy not to pick up the name Alan Adale from the movie. Oh, incidentally, I'm Alan Adale, a minstrel. And it doesn't get written up at the start like the other character names do. The Rooster.
It took me at least 10 years, I think, to realise that he was Alan Adale.
I think I remember thinking at one point he should be Alan Adale. He's supposed to be the minstrel type of merry man, and then one day watching the film he says it at that point, and I'm like, oh, he is Alan Adale.
While we're on him, I always thought, slight problem with the film here, that he didn't really achieve the balance between character and narrator. He mainly narrates, and it's only very rarely that anyone even registers his presence.
It is very good how they hired several appropriate voice actors as well as their bank of Disney voice actors that they were using at the time. And really that bank mostly does kind of backup characters. Obviously Little John, as you were saying, Phil Harris is from their bank. And Pat Buttram, who played the sheriff, I know he's in at least The Fox and the Hound, isn't he?
Being a sort of tertiary dog character, much less appropriate use of him like Phil Harris in that.
But they did make very special effort to cast, as you were saying, Robin Hood, Prince John, as well as Maid Marian, Sir Hiss. Robin and Marian are very much appropriate English voices that go very well with the characters. Brian Bedford and Monica Evans.
And I read somewhere that the lady who voices Marian's lady-in-waiting, Lady Clark, she and Monica Evans were often appearing together in sort of, skits and things. So they had a good chemistry and rapport for Marian and her lady-in-waiting.
And that certainly works, certainly comes across. Peter Ustinov as Prince John, and later King Richard as well, and Terry Thomas as Sir Hiss make a wonderful comedy duo. Always some of the most memorable and funny bits of the movie, those two talking and arguing together.
In a way, Sir Hiss is a sort of straight man, isn't he? And then Prince John overreacts to when he's talking sense and saying that they're bandits and he doesn't want to hear it and stuff like that. And like Skeletor, Prince John is extremely successful as a comedy villain and a genuinely threatening villain. And there's that bit at the archery contest where everyone's saying, "Long live King Richard," and all that kind of thing on about King Richard again. And then he's having this tantrum going, "I am king, king, king." And then the very next line is, "Off with his head."
It's an absolute immediate and very striking comparison of those two parts of the character, and takes him directly from funny, ridiculous laugh at him to very genuine threat. How is anyone going to stop him being evil? I think it's probably the best example of that aspect of villains that we've talked about so much that's very difficult to achieve, shown very clearly in one very quick bit of a scene. So really, I think Disney's Robin Hood uses limited resources, limited effort on some people's parts to make a very good final result. Certainly, it's really the only Disney movie from, like, the 70s that I want to watch at all regularly. Thinking of things like The Aristocats and The Rescuers and Basil the Great Mouse Detective.
I think Brian Bedford really gets into the role, doesn't he? And he's quite versatile, which means that he's good for doing the voices of Robin in disguise. And he's got quite a few disguises, hasn't he? He's got the poor old blind beggar, which I suppose anybody could adapt their voice to that, if they were a halfway decent actor, but he's also got the fortune teller woman and the spindle-legged stork, which is his archery contest disguise. And he disguises disguises himself as Nutsy in order to break into Nottingham Castle to rescue Friar Tuck.
Yes, when they were casting Robin Hood, they needed not only the British voice to go with Maid Marian's, but an actor who would also be able to do those impressions, and Brian Bedford fit the bill perfectly.
Again, I think we've come to the conclusion that it really is the performances of the actors that make these things or break these things.
Moving on to Prince of Thieves 1991, we were remarking this time how there's perhaps a bit of homage to Disney's Robin Hood when Kevin Costner's Robin Hood is pretending to be the blind beggar towards the end of that movie. But his blind beggar voice was not a patch on Brian Bedford.
Well, to be fair, his Robin Hood is not a patch on Brian Bedford's, and we were saying, weren't we, he's by no means the best thing in the movie, and he certainly doesn't ruin it. He's fine, but as you were saying, I think a construct, someone to do what Robin Hood does and say what Robin Hood says, but he's not striking in the role, and it's really the supporting cast who make anything of the movie, particularly Alan Rickman, who we'll probably talk about in more detail a bit later.
Robin Hood Prince of Thieves was really sold as, marketed as, a big movie. We were surprised to discover, weren't we, that it hadn't actually won any Oscars.
It wasn't nominated for any Oscars. And the one award it did win, which was for the song Everything I Do It For You, wasn't an Oscar, it was some other award.
Obviously, it was supposed to be one of these big genre-defining or genre-reinvigorating blockbusters. As we mentioned in the Maid Marian podcast, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves came out halfway through Maid Marian when there was a bit of a gap between Maid Marian Series 2 and Series 3. And they start making quite a few references to it in Maid Marian, the show, as we did mention. And it's little Ron who says, when they're talking about the possibility of a Robin Hood moving picture in the future, Robin Hood is going to get upstaged by the Sheriff of Nottingham, a direct reference there to Alan Rickman really vastly upstaged Kevin Costner in that movie, making much more of an impact on screen, being incredibly funny, and Kevin Costner, when he has funny things to say or tries to be funny, isn't really funny. As you said, he's just kind of there filling the role, and it's all you need, but it's not, wow, this is really brilliant.
Some people make objection to him not attempting an English accent, some guy on YouTube anyway, and it's referenced in Robin Hood Men in Tights, which we shall come to briefly later. But actually, I don't mind that. I'd rather that he didn't try than that he did one really badly, especially as the accents don't all sound the same. There are people doing what I call an ancient Greek accent, which I did explain on another podcast, meaning a quite American-sounding attempt at an English accent. And it was such a long time ago, and we don't know how people spoke then, that they might as well speak like anything. So that doesn't worry me at all, and I think he would have really damaged his performance, which is fine as it is, had he attempted that and made it not fine.
I was quite young when I first watched Prince of Thieves, and I was a bit miffed at the beginning. All this stuff going on in the Holy Land, load of people in prison with beards. I'm like, what is this? This isn't Robin Hood.
It was me, I stole the bread. It's like, what's that got to do with Robin Hood?
And then after a few minutes, you get one of these beardy, weirdy, nondescript characters saying his name is Robin of Locksley. And I'm like, oh, right, okay, so this is supposed to be Robin Hood, but it's not Robin Hood yet. And then we do get towards the right sort of thing. They're back in England. There's Norman soldiers to fight. He's going into Sherwood Forest to hide. There's Little John and the bridge scene on a kind of causeway, but you can tell what it's meant to be. And what an interesting way they reference the bridge scene in Disney's Robin Hood, don't they? At the beginning, with Robin Hood and Little John come to a forked log going across the river, and both say, oh, you go first, and go together and both fall in.
Yes, as I was saying, no more preamble than that. Whereas in Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, doesn't it take a long time to get there? And when it was first on our television, of course I was even younger than you, as I am at any given time, I couldn't sit through it. I was bored by the Holy Land stuff. And when Robin gets to England, along with Asim, played by Morgan Freeman, who is another very, very strong performer in this film, I couldn't understand him at all. He leaps out of the boat and starts, as it seemed to me, eating the sand. And I was like, Mummy, what's he doing that for? And our mum said, oh, well, it's because he's so happy to be home. He's been away a long time. But I hadn't got that impression or taken it in at all. I didn't know about the Crusades. And then he finds that his father, Brian Blessed, has been killed, and he's burying him and making a vow to avenge his death, or whatever it is he says, and slicing his own hand open so that he can swear on his own blood. But I didn't see why that was necessary. I thought Robin Hood was a flipping nutter from all that, and he wasn't even being Robin Hood whilst doing it. So I got very, very bored, and I may have given up at the bridge scene, which has become a causeway scene. I don't know what it was that made me walk away at that point, but that's the way I remember it. So I couldn't even sit through it the first time.
So perhaps it's fair to say it's not a good movie for kids, particularly British kids who have an idea of what Robin Hood should be like and how Robin Hood should look. It disappointed me enormously when I was young that they never start dressing up in Lincoln green. But actually, when you're more grown up and you think about it logically, it's a good movie. It's not a perfect movie. It doesn't have everything you want from a Robin Hood movie. It doesn't have the archery contest.
And I was a bit disappointed when I did finally manage to watch the whole thing and quite enjoyed it, that it didn't have Prince John. And you were saying to me the other day that you didn't feel like you necessarily wanted Prince John. And I was saying, oh, I do. And I thought about it and I realised that what I'd grown up watching was Maid Marian and Disney, and they both had the Sheriff and Prince John. And if I don't see very much of the Sheriff, but I do see more of Prince John, that disappoints me as well. I've got this idea that there really ought to be both of them in quite major roles.
My go-to Robin Hood resource when I was that young, apart from the Lego, was a Ladybird book called The Silver Arrow, which is all about the sheriff scheming and doesn't have Prince or King John in it in any way, which is probably why I don't expect to see him, but I also don't expect not to see him because of Maid Marian, etc. But what makes it a good movie? Well, strong performances from a lot of people. Alan Rickman, Morgan Freeman, we've talked about. And really all of the supporting cast who bring the world to life, like Nick Brimble as Little John, like the lady who plays his wife, Fanny, like the sheriff's scribe, like Duncan, whose ordeal of having his eyes taken out I was quite horrified by when I was little.
That's another thing I did not understand when we first watched it. I said to our mum, well, what has happened here? I must have been awfully annoying, mustn't I, asking all these questions? She said, oh, they burned his eyes out. And I was like, why? She said, oh, they just used to do that to punish people. And I thought, well, this is the strangest film I've ever seen, and it's not even very interesting.
And of course, Mike McShane as Friar Tuck. Very amusing performance, as Mike McShane will always do, and yet also very real and believable.
I think even when I was able to sit through it, a lot of the time I was thinking, well, where the hell is Friar Tuck? It takes him a while to turn up.
And also Michael Wincott as Guy of Gisborne, who I always found quite a good sort of sleazy, disturbing, Toad Air Marshal, cowardly but dangerous sort of villain.
When I was a child, I was struck by how different his performance was from that of Ramsay Gilderdale in Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. This guy on YouTube who was talking about accents and things, I think it was Movie Sense, was talking about how they always use a weird lens and a weird angle on Guy of Gisborne's face. And I thought, oh yes, they do. That's why it's always a bit uncomfortable watching him.
But I do think the other main stars who we haven't mentioned might be a little bit better than Kevin Costner, but they could be other people and it wouldn't hurt the movie, and they could even be a bit better. Christian Slater as Will Scarlet, who has the big role in the movie, it turns out, as Robin Hood's half-brother, with a lot of motivation and beef that's been driving him through the movie. Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio as Maid Marian.
Both doing ancient Greek accents, and one thing that amuses me very much is that Christian Slater's English accent gets better when he's upside down.
I know who else goes on my list of strong performances making the universe. Geraldine McEwen as Mortiana the Witch, the young actor as Wolf, Little John's oldest child.
Fanny tells us later she's had 8, doesn't she? One of which is born in a very striking scene where she's in some trouble. Your baby cannot be born without help. And some people aren't quite sure if Asim turns the baby or does a cesarean without anaesthetic and everything. But I was always, once I managed to get that far into the movie, quite happy that it was a cesarean because he wants needle and thread, because she needs Marion to give her something to bite down on more than she already was just from the labour pains. I say just from the labour pains, of course, they're very painful indeed. It's quite tense, and there's the jeopardy, of course, and there's also the aspect of, can we trust the Moor? He's killing her with his barbarian ways, and Friar Tuck is adamant that he shouldn't be allowed to touch Fanny trying to have this baby, and then afterwards, of course, it's worked, and he shakes his hand and says, though I may be godly, I am not worldly, and learning all about accepting other people and other cultures and religions, and that's something that you don't really associate with Robin Hood, isn't it? Unlike the archery contest, which isn't there, and the Lincoln Green, which isn't there. But it's a good scene anyway.
I really like the line from Morgan Freeman where he says, I've seen it many times with horses. And you think, well, that's not quite the same thing, is it? And if anyone is going to do something that they know how to do, but they're not really qualified to do it and they don't fully know what they're doing, I say, oh, this person's seen it many times with horses. But of course he is right, it is basically the same thing. A cesarean on a horse, a cesarean on a human. So there's another reason why the film is a good movie. Scenes like that, making you think, connecting with you emotionally, taking the characters on a journey with aspects we may not be expecting, as well as the usual ones. And it does have the aspects we are expecting, robbing from the rich to feed the poor. And by God, we take it back. Rescuing people from Nottingham Castle at the end for the denouement. The romance between Robin and Marion.
It's not as compelling as when they're animated Fox and Vixen, is it? I don't think they have the most chemistry. I think Kevin Costner doesn't have the most chemistry with anyone. So you don't get massively into it, but you're just happy that it's there because it's what you expect to see.
Another actor, really, with a cameo is Sean Connery as King Richard at the end. Why is King Richard Scottish? Well, because he's Sean Connery. And both those movies that we've just talked about, Disney and Prince of Thieves, do present King Richard comes back at the end and everything is fine now. But of course, as we know from history, that really is a folklore fairy tale ending. King Richard may have come back to England at some point, but he certainly soon sodded off again and got killed in the Holy Land, and King John ruled the country rather badly for 17 years. So really, I think the one that's most accurate with King Richard is Maid Marian and Her Merry Men.
Yes, I think we talked in that podcast about how they did a twist on that ending and a more likely version, despite all the surreality of Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. And it's not like Alan Adale the Rooster says, King Richard returned and, well, he just strained everything out.
Which I suppose backs up the point about folklore being that mix of storytelling fantasy and real historical events. So now we'll talk a little about other Robin Hood adaptations through the years. Sometimes, and I'm not sure if we've done it on podcast, we talk about genre-defining pieces, which may not be the absolute best example of a book or a movie or whatever in that genre, but it creates the genre, and everything that follows it references back somehow to this one thing and can't really help doing it. And it's kind of a trendsetter. Night of the Living Dead for the modern zombie movie is a big example of that, a genre creator. Dracula for the vampire genre is an example of a novel that does that.
Another example of a novel that does that is Treasure Island, the pirate genre.
And one such genre-defining piece, I think it's pretty indisputable to say, is the 1938 Errol Flynn movie, The Adventures of Robin Hood.
I've heard people say or read that people have written about that. It's the only Robin Hood movie you really need, and you never should watch another Robin Hood movie. Sort of like I was saying that people say about Michael York's Three Musketeers and Four Musketeers. And I can see what they mean, because as you say, it's genre defining. It's got everything that you want. But I don't agree with them that it's the only Robin Hood movie you need, because when we did sit and watch it, I actually found it quite boring. Rather like Treasure Island, really, when I read it.
It's very colourful, it's very striking, it's very swashbuckling.
Of course, they'd only recently started being able to make films in colour, so they were colourful at that time, and somebody must have thought, hey, Robin Hood would look great in colour.
And really, that person was right. One thing that it apparently kicked off that I didn't realise and was interested to see when we watched this several years ago was the sword fighting shadows sequence that I've seen taken off various things. The only thing I can remember is Bugs Bunny and Yosemite Sam doing it.
I think Buffy does that at one point, And you do see it, don't you, even if you can't think of it all at once.
So things like that, if you're watching a movie and that's there in it for the first time, you could be pretty sure you're watching a genre-defining piece, and scenes from it will be adapted into similar genres down the years because it becomes iconic. On a slight side point, I was interested to hear in a documentary, it may have been the one with Tony Robinson, that if we're trying to find the actual origins of Robin Hood or the real noble who might have been Robin Hood, the only place called Locksley, where he might have been Robin of Locksley from, is in South Yorkshire. So perhaps if Robin Hood really was Robin of Locksley, he'd entered Sherwood Forest from the top end rather than the Nottingham end. And of course Sherwood Forest covered a huge amount of space in those days, much more than the large tree and visitor centre that it does nowadays. But it makes me wonder, maybe the High Sheriff of Yorkshire would have had more to do with Robin Hood, really. And certainly you can read connections between Robin Hood and Yorkshire, chief among them being, of course, the village of Robin Hood Bay.
The one other actor I remember in that movie is Olivia de Havilland as Marion. And again, I think she and Robin didn't have an enormous amount of chemistry. And we're going to say that again about at least one other Robin and Marion. It seems to be quite hard to get a Robin and a Marion that really click. Again, I think maybe Maid Marian and her Merry Men did the best job at that, and they don't even have a romance.
And speaking of Tony Robinson and his Robin Hood documentary, the next thing I've written down to reference is another thing called The Adventures of Robin Hood, but this time a TV series, the black and white one, that was on from 1955 to 1959. And perhaps this is what Tony Robinson grew up with as his staple go-to Robin Hood reference. And we don't really know anything about that show, do we?
No, I just remember Tony Robinson telling us about it on some sort of documentary. I don't think it was one of his own this time. I think it was one where various celebrities sit and talk about something that was on TV, and there are a couple of clips from it, and he's remembering how Maid Marian was living with them in the hideout, which you don't always get, do you? But in this clip that they showed and they overlaid with him talking, she was sitting there in Sherwood Forest and they were having their dinner or something. Tony Robinson was talking about how she was one of the merry men, as it were, and perhaps the representation of her as a woman was a bit ahead of its time, but on the other hand, I remember him saying her name is Maid Marian, she's named after the fact that she's never had sex.
Chronologically, the next thing on my list is the very famous series Robin of Sherwood, which aired from 1984 to 1986. We didn't watch it, being either not alive or very, very small and not really noticing what was going on the telly or elsewhere. I don't know that it really was on in our house, certainly not regularly, but I think our parents did know it a bit. But we've said at times to each other, and I'm sure it's true, that it seems to be the go-to reference for nightmare contestants when they're talking about Robin Hood and answering questions about Robin Hood, which makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It was on from 1984 to 1986, and they were kind of children and teenagers, the nightmare contestants at that point. They know all about Robin of Sherwood. Perhaps it's not genre-defining in the same way as Errol Flynn, but I think it certainly is genre reinvigorating and was a go-to for a whole new generation. Interestingly enough, One thing I do know about Robin of Sherwood is that it has 3 series, and in the 3rd series there is a different person being Robin Hood. Like Teabag becomes a new person in Teabag.
Oh, well, that was the death of it then, wasn't it? Nobody wants a different Robin Hood.
They go for not recasting the parts, but having a new character to take on the title. So here's the new Teabag, she's the old Teabag's sister. Here's the new Robin Hood. It's not Robin of Locksley anymore, but Robert of Huntingdon. He is Jason Connery, Sean Connery's son, of course. But we always noticed how in the BBC 2006 to 2009 series, very early on, they were doing the whole "we are Robin Hood" thing. Robin Hood is not one specific person, and if Jonas Armstrong dies, i.e. wants to leave the series at any point, we can still all be Robin Hood, and it doesn't need this one person to be Robin Hood. And perhaps they thought they could get away with that partly because of Robin of Sherwood.
They were very aware that they might want to try that because actors do get such itchy feet nowadays, I think, more than they used to, although obviously this original Robin of Sherwood had that.
And even though that series isn't the next thing chronologically, we might as well finish talking about it. It's been mentioned before on the Musketeers podcast because it is the same sort of Saturday night entertainment, or the BBC thought so anyway. It comes from the same place, the same intention, the same audience as Luke Pasqualino and friends in the Musketeers, and Merlin, which we will mention in the fairly near future. And Robin Hood was the first of those, and it had 3 series between 2006 and 2009, end of 2006 and early 2009, and at the end of the 3rd series, Jonas Armstrong, who played Robin Hood, left the series. The character died, and they didn't bring it back without him, so perhaps they realised the "we are Robin Hood" thing wasn't going to wash after all. I watched the first episode of the 3rd series, having watched the first 2 series, and gave up on it at that point, at the beginning of the 3rd series. I thought, good God, I can't watch this anymore. It's so bad. Perhaps I would have stuck with it if I knew it was only going to be one more series, but it certainly wasn't worth watching.
I think a very good performance that actually made it watchable was Keith Allen as the sheriff, and there you really see the influence from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, don't you? It's like you kind of expect the sheriff to be amusing now, and he was, and the other influence that I think came directly from that was Little John having a wife. The actor that everyone did like, though, and who they got to be Geraldine Granger's eventual husband in The Vicar of Dibley, was Richard Armitage as Guy of Gisborne, and again a very different performance from what we've seen before. He was rather trailing round after Marion like a lovesick puppy, the way I remember it.
He certainly was. Robin and Marion had absolutely no chemistry and were famous for it, and the Radio Times said so that proves it. And that was an aspect of the show that really wasn't striking and we could have done without. But I quite liked it to begin with. Keith Allen as the sheriff, as you say, Gordon Kennedy as Little John, very entertaining, and everyone was quite watchable, I think. But quite quickly, it kept being the same thing every week, which was that someone was captured and taken to Nottingham Castle, and everyone else came to get them out. And that's all there was to it.
I enjoyed the baddies more than the goodies. It's one of those, like the Dreamstone. Jonas Armstrong and friends fell a bit flat for me, I'm afraid. And the lady playing Marion was called Lucy Griffiths, I remember, and she was fine on her own. She was all right with Guy of Gisborne, actually. But then when she got together with her allies, particularly Robin, there was really nothing there.
One thing that was noted about it as a criticism, something to laugh at, was that in some ways it didn't seem to be very firmly set in medieval times. The costumes, I think, particularly, were strikingly anachronistic at times. Robin Hoodie and Marion and her yellow knitted cardigan didn't seem to fit very well, and that weren't the only things. And indeed it was taken off on Dead Ringers when they were doing a sketch clearly supposed to be an episode of BBC Robin Hood, and they were saying things like, "Oh, look, Sheriff, have you seen what Robin Hood's tweeted about you?" And then at the end it culminates in them having a dance-off like Run DMC but Jason Nevin. instead of a sword fight. And I think we quite engaged with that at the time.
Yes, we'd been noticing bloody BBC trying to engage with their youth. They always misfire when they attempt that.
The next thing chronologically on the list I made after Robin of Sherwood TV series is Robin Hood Men in Tights from 1993, a couple of years after Prince of Thieves. And in many ways it's a direct movie parody of Prince of Thieves. It's a Mel Brooks comedy.
Certainly Prince of Thieves was the film that inspired them to make it in the first place.
But there are certain things about it that do come from elsewhere in the genre. Principally, it does have all the Lincoln green stuff.
And the archery contest, which we've mentioned a few times.
And Prince John, of course, is in it.
That would have been a factor in me wanting to get it out of Blockbuster more than once. And I thought, yes, it has all the right ingredients. And I did quite enjoy the humour at that age. And I haven't really seen it since I've been grown up. Thinking about what I do remember, I think maybe I wouldn't really find it funny anymore.
I'm extremely wary of possibly watching Robin Hood Men in Tights again, because I've come away from it, like you have, thinking, that was funny, that was good. But like Dracula Dead and Loving It, another Mel Brooks comedy, if we did watch it again now, I think we probably wouldn't find it very funny, as you say. Some of the direct bits of Prince of Thieves lampooning we did enjoy, and we did relate immediately back to that movie, like the bit with Robin Hood eating the sand that had perplexed you so much. Cary Elwes does take that off and start going when he's kissing the sand.
Yes, I must have enjoyed that. The actor playing the sheriff is directly basing his performance on Alan Rickman, quite clearly.
And at the wedding, Mervyn, Sheriff of Rottingham, instead of George, Sheriff of Nottingham from Prince of Thieves. Very funny. Your name is Mervyn.
Yes, that I do remember as being funny and may even be funny again.
The witch from Prince of Thieves is directly taken off in Men in Tights, and I think it's Prince John, actually, rather than the sheriff who's going to her and saying, tell me this, tell me that, and she's saying, look, if you want prophecy, get yourself a witch. I'm just your cook. She's actually this disgusting old cook.
And she's serving him all the Eye of Newt stuff that she's been putting in the pot.
So I think that very much worked at the time as a direct parody, and perhaps would still, I don't know.
And of course they do all the stuff in the Holy Land, and he meets someone who is like Morgan Freeman and says his name is Asneez, but then it ends up being Asneez's son Achu, who stays with him throughout the movie and does that kind of Keenan comedy.
That's right, along with Blinkin instead of Duncan, the family's blind old servant. He hasn't had his eyes plucked out in this one, or burned out. He's always been blind.
Yes, and in the scene where they come to the castle and find it in ruins, the comedy, because he's blind, he's got absolutely no idea that the castle doesn't exist around him, and he's like on the toilet and stuff and saying, I'll be out in a minute, and they can see him.
The next thing on my list, chronologically, and there's only two more, is something we have mentioned, I'm not sure where, a TV series called Back to Sherwood. And it was originally on in America in 1998. It was one of these things that CITV got hold of and kind of started showing it and then had a bit of a gap. They couldn't really be bothered to show it and then stuck it on Sunday morning so you could finish it if you wanted to. Like the Mystic Knights of Tir na Nog and Minty. And it was a strange thing, really. It was about Robin with a Y hood, a direct descendant of the original Robin Hood, going back to Sherwood, back in time to Sherwood Forest.
So they're asking you to believe that Robin and Marion managed to procreate. It's hard to imagine them getting to that stage in many adaptations.
And she had to collect a load of magical artifacts, like a sort of quest, that were going to free Robin and Marion from this magical prison that this witch had put them in on the orders of what we assumed was the Sheriff of Nottingham. They called him Guy of Gisborne at one point. Perhaps he was both in that universe, Guy of Gisborne and the Sheriff of Nottingham. And she used to pop back and forth between Robin Hood times and modern times, and her grandfather was in on it. And she picked up the three young outlaws, Joan Little, Phil Scarlet, and Alana Dale, who I suppose were meant to be the children of the originals, doing exactly the same things their parents do.
And it took her about 7 episodes to get one thing, which was clearly the show makers hedging their bets about how many seasons they were going to get.
Perhaps they were hoping it was going to be the next Sabrina. I think the girl playing Robin Hood was very much from the same type of casting call as Melissa Joan Hart might have gone to, but it was never going to be that sort of success.
And who was that guy that she was having a ship with? He was somebody who they didn't really trust and was coming from Nottingham Castle, I think. And he's the one that we laughed at because he was trying to do an English accent and he couldn't say turret.
Turrets!
And I can't remember what they were calling him.
I can't remember a damn thing about him except that turrets thing, and I'd have guessed that it was Phil Scarlett that had said that because I've completely forgotten the character. So that's all there is to say about that, really. It existed, we watched it. It's not really worth talking about, but we've done it anyway. The last thing on my list is a film called Robin Hood from 2010, and it's got Russell Crowe in it. And from what I understand of it, it is the feeling I got when first watching Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. What the hell is this? This isn't Robin Hood. It's not set in England, it's set in the Crusade sort of thing. What's going on? It's that, but it then doesn't turn into proper Robin Hood. The whole thing is Robin Hood doing the wrong thing in the wrong place for what you want to see in a Robin Hood movie.
Yeah, we haven't actually seen that one, but we're going to blacklist it anyway. I didn't want to see it when I first heard about it because it came off the back of that King Arthur thing. I don't remember the name of it, but I remember it had Keira Knightley in it. And we did watch that, and it was so boring. And what it was attempting to do was show what it would have been like or might have been like if you just take the aspects of the legend that are probably real. Which isn't really what we want, is it? We want the legend, we don't want speculation about what it would have been like if it were more boring. So I have rejected any opportunity to watch that Russell Crowe Robin Hood.
All I really remember about it was Russell Crowe in the news getting all butthurt because people had criticised his accent. But I'm sure it was pretty terrible anyway. I mean, that hardly makes him exclusive and you shouldn't feel bad about it.
You know, as we're talking about things we haven't seen, I think I'll just mention, do you remember I saw that trailer on YouTube for some sort of Robin Hood thing recently, and all we had to say about it was those people cannot act. And I don't know what it was, and I've never heard of it since, but I just thought it was worth mentioning to demonstrate that Robin Hood is still being adapted.
And I suppose in whatever way people are adapting things in the future, it always will be, because it is staple English legend. Next time, we'll be doing a podcast on the other staple English legend, which it seems may have taken a back seat to Robin Hood over the past 30 years, but hopefully this will help it make a comeback. It will be a podcast on adaptations of King Arthur, Camelot, Arthurian legend. So hopefully you'll join us again for that, which will be the final Sunday in April. Until then,
Good night out there.
whatever you are.